Have you ever wondered what would happen if your biggest weakness became your greatest strength? Sophie Lin was about to find out when she walked into the conference room that Tuesday morning, completely unaware that her quiet "no" would change everything. The billionaire CEO sitting across from her had never been rejected before, and her humility was about to turn his world upside down. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Sophie Lin had always believed that invisibility was her superpower. At 27, she had perfected the art of blending into the background, her dark hair always pulled back in a simple ponytail, her clothes chosen for comfort rather than style. She preferred numbers to people, spreadsheets to small talk, and the quiet hum of her corner cubicle to the chaos of corporate meetings. As a senior financial analyst at Whitmore Industries, she had spent 3 years building models that saved the company millions, yet few people beyond her immediate team even knew her name. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Sophie arrived at the office 45 minutes early, as was her habit, settling into her workspace with a cup of coffee that had gone cold before she remembered to drink it. The 43rd floor of the Whitmore building offered a spectacular view of the city, but Sophie kept her back to the windows, preferring the comfort of her dual monitors and the familiar glow of Excel spreadsheets. She was deep in analyzing quarterly projections when her manager, Janet Morrison, appeared at her cubicle with an expression Sophie couldn't quite read. Janet was a woman in her 50s who had climbed the corporate ladder through sheer determination and an ability to navigate office politics that Sophie both admired and found exhausting. "Sophie, I need you to come with me," Janet said, her voice carrying an unusual tension. "There's a meeting." Sophie's stomach immediately tightened. She hated meetings, especially unexpected ones. "What kind of meeting?" "The kind where you smile and nod and try not to overthink everything," Janet replied, though her attempt at humor fell flat. "Trust me on this one." The elevator ride to the 52nd floor felt interminable. Sophie had never been to the executive levels before, and the polished marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows made her feel even smaller than usual. Her hands were clammy as she smoothed down her simple black cardigan, suddenly hyper-aware of how underdressed she felt in this world of power suits and designer accessories. Janet led her down a hallway lined with abstract art that probably cost more than Sophie's annual salary, stopping at a conference room with glass walls that offered no place to hide. Inside, Sophie counted 8 people in expensive suits, all of whom turned to look at her as she entered. The attention made her skin crickle with discomfort. At the head of the table sat a man Sophie recognized from company newsletters and business magazines, though she had never seen him in person. Daniel Whitmore was younger than she had expected, perhaps in his mid-30s, with sharp features and dark hair that looked like it had been styled by someone who charged more per hour than Sophie made in a week. He wore his authority like a well-tailored suit, and when his eyes met hers, Sophie felt as though he could see right through her carefully constructed walls. "Please sit," Daniel said, gesturing to an empty chair across from him. His voice was smooth, cultured, with the kind of confidence that came from never having to question whether people would listen when he spoke. Sophie sat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, trying to make herself as small as possible. She was acutely aware of every sound in the room, from the scratch of pens on paper to the whisper of expensive fabric as people shifted in their chairs. "Sophie," Daniel began, leaning back in his chair with the casual posture of someone completely at ease with power. "I've been reviewing your work. Your analysis on the Henderson acquisition was exceptional. The risk assessment model you developed saved us from what could have been a very expensive mistake." Sophie felt heat rise in her cheeks. She had spent weeks on that project, working late into the night to perfect every calculation, but she had never expected anyone at this level to notice. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I also reviewed your projections for the Southeast expansion," Daniel continued. "Your insights into market volatility were particularly impressive. You identified patterns that our external consultants missed entirely." Sophie nodded, unsure how to respond. She had always found comfort in numbers because they were predictable, logical, free from the messy complications of human emotion. But sitting in this room, feeling the weight of Daniel's attention, She realized that her carefully ordered world was about to become very complicated indeed. Daniel leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. "Which brings me to why you're here. We have a position opening up, Director of Strategic Analysis. It would mean a significant salary increase, a corner office on this floor, and direct access to executive decision-making processes. You'd be reporting directly to me." The room fell silent, except for the barely audible hum of the air conditioning. Sophie felt as though the walls were closing in around her. A corner office on the executive floor meant visibility, attention, presentations to rooms full of people who would expect her to speak with authority about things that felt too important for someone like her to be or I. Influence. I appreciate the offer, Sophie said slowly, her voice steadier than she felt. "But I'm going to have to decline." The silence that followed was deafening. Sophie could feel the shock radiating from everyone in the room. She kept her eyes fixed on her hands, unable to look up and see the confusion or disappointment on their faces. "I'm sorry," Daniel said after a long moment, his voice carefully controlled. "Did you say you're declining?" Sophie forced herself to meet his gaze. His dark eyes were intense, searching, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly become much more complex than he had anticipated. "Yes, sir. I'm happy in my current position. I prefer working behind the scenes. The salary increase would be substantial," said a woman Sophie didn't recognize, her voice sharp with disbelief. "We're talking about a 150% increase in compensation, plus equity options." Sophie's stomach lurched. The money would change her life, could pay off her student loans, help her support her parents who were struggling with her father's medical bills. But the thought of sitting in meetings like this one every day, of being responsible for decisions that could affect thousands of employees, made her feel like she couldn't breathe. "I understand," Sophie replied quietly, "but I'm not interested in a management position. I prefer analytical work." Daniel was studying her with an expression she couldn't read. There was something in his eyes that made her even more uncomfortable than the attention of the room. Something that felt like genuine curiosity rather than professional disappointment. "Can I ask why?" he said finally. Sophie felt her heart racing. She had rehearsed this conversation in her head during the elevator ride, but now, under the intensity of his gaze, her carefully prepared explanation seemed inadequate. "I'm not comfortable with public speaking or managing people. I work better independently." "Those are skills that can be developed," Daniel said. "We would provide training, support, whatever you need to succeed." The kindness in his voice was somehow worse than if he had been dismissive or angry. Sophie found herself wanting to explain, to make him understand that this wasn't about fear or lack of ambition, but about knowing herself well enough to recognize her limitations. "I've seen what happens to people who take positions they're not suited for," she said, thinking of her college roommate who had burned out spectacularly trying to climb the corporate ladder, of her own father who had taken a promotion that stressed him into a heart attack. "I'd rather excel at what I do well than fail at something I'm not equipped for." Daniel nodded slowly, as if considering her words. "And what if I told you that your analytical skills are exactly what we need at the strategic level? That your tendency to think deeply rather than speak quickly is precisely what's been missing from our decision-making process?" Sophie felt herself wavering. The way he framed it made her qualities sound like assets rather than limitations. But she had learned long ago that people often said what they thought others wanted to hear, and she couldn't afford to make such an important decision based on flattery. "I appreciate your confidence in me," she said. "But my answer is still no." The meeting ended shortly after that, with handshakes and polite smiles that didn't quite reach anyone's eyes. Sophie walked back to the elevator with Janet, who maintained a stunned silence until the doors closed behind them. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Janet asked, her voice a mixture of awe and horror. Sophie stared at the floor numbers as they descended. "I turned down a job I wasn't qualified for." "You turned down Daniel Whitmore," Janet said. "Do you know who he is, really now?" Sophie shrugged. "He's the CEO. I know he's successful." Janet let out a bitter laugh. "Sophie, He's not just successful. He's one of the youngest billionaires in the country. He built this company from nothing after his father's business failed. He's been featured on the cover of Forbes 6 times. And you just told him no. The elevator dinged softly as they reached their floor. Sophie stepped out, feeling the familiar comfort of returning to her own territory. Well, then he'll understand why someone like me shouldn't be making decisions at his level. But as she settled back into her cubicle, Sophie couldn't shake the image of Daniel's face when she had declined his offer. There had been something there beyond professional disappointment, something that looked almost like intrigue. Over the next few days, Sophie tried to return to her normal routine, but she found herself distracted in ways that were entirely unlike her. She caught herself looking toward the elevators more often, wondering if she would see Daniel Whitmore again. She researched him online during her lunch break, reading articles about his business philosophy and his reputation for being impossible to impress. The more she learned, the more confused she became about why he had offered her the position in the first place. Daniel Whitmore was known for his exacting standards, his ability to spot potential that others missed, and his track record of turning analytical minds into business leaders. He didn't make offers lightly, and according to every article she read, he certainly didn't accept rejection gracefully. On Thursday afternoon, Sophie was reviewing budget projections when Janet appeared at her desk again, this time with an expression that was pure bewilderment. "You have a lunch meeting," Janet announced. Sophie looked up from her spreadsheet. "I don't have any lunch meetings scheduled." "You do now, with Daniel Whitmore, today, noon." Sophie's hands stilled on her keyboard. "Why, I have absolutely no idea," Janet replied. "But when the CEO's assistant calls and says he wants to take you to lunch, you don't ask questions. You just go." The restaurant Daniel had chosen was the kind of place Sophie had only read about in magazines. The maitre d' led them to a private table by the window, where the city sprawled out below them like a living map. Sophie felt acutely aware of her simple blouse and cardigan among the designer dresses and business suits of the other diners. Daniel arrived exactly on time, looking effortlessly elegant in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Sophie's monthly rent. He smiled as he sat down, and Sophie was struck by how different he seemed outside the formal conference room setting. There was still an aura of power about him, but it felt less intimidating somehow. "Thank you for agreeing to lunch," he said as the waiter filled their water glasses. "I hope you don't mind that I was persistent." Sophie smiled nervously. "I wasn't sure I had a choice." "You always have a choice," Daniel replied, his tone serious. "That's something I learned about you the other day. You're not afraid to make choices that others might find incomprehensible." The waiter took their orders, and Sophie found herself relaxing slightly as the conversation moved to safer topics. Daniel asked about her background, her education, her interests outside of work. She was surprised to discover that he was genuinely curious about her answers, that he listened with the kind of focused attention she was used to giving to financial data. "You studied mathematics at Northwestern," he said as their appetizers arrived. "Why did you go into finance instead of pursuing something more academic?" Sophie considered the question. "I wanted something practical. My parents immigrated here when I was 10, and they sacrificed everything to give me opportunities they never had. I wanted a career that would provide stability, that would let me take care of them. And you chose analysis over client-facing roles because I'm better with numbers than with people," Sophie said simply. "Numbers don't have ulterior motives or hidden agendas. They don't judge you or expect you to be something you're not." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "But people aren't always as complicated as we make them out to be. Sometimes they're just looking for someone who will tell them the truth, even when it's not what they want to hear." Sophie thought about her rejection of his job offer. "Is that what I did the other day?" "Among other things," Daniel replied with a slight smile. "Can I ask you something? Have you ever considered that your reluctance to take risks might actually be limiting your impact? That you might be able to help more people, including your parents, if you were willing to step outside your comfort zone?" The question stung, because it echoed thoughts that had been nagging at Sophie since the meeting. She had always prided herself on being practical, on making safe choices that wouldn't lead to disappointment or failure. But lately, She wondered if her caution was actually a form of fear. "I've considered it," she admitted. "But I've also seen what happens when people reach too far beyond their capabilities. My father tried to expand his small business too quickly and ended up losing everything. I learned early that it's better to be realistic about your limitations." "What if I told you that I don't think you're reaching beyond your capabilities?" Daniel said. "What if I told you that your self-awareness and analytical thinking are exactly what make you qualified for leadership?" Sophie set down her fork, studying his face. "Why does this matter to you? You could hire any number of people who would jump at the chance to work at the executive level. Why are you trying to convince someone who clearly doesn't want the job?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "Because most people who want power are the last ones who should have it. They're motivated by ego, by the desire to prove something to themselves or others. But you're motivated by something else entirely. You genuinely care about doing good work, about making a positive impact without needing recognition for it." He leaned forward slightly, his voice becoming more earnest. "Do you know how rare that is? I meet with executives and entrepreneurs every day who are brilliant, ambitious, driven, but most of them are performing, trying to impress me or get something from me. You're the first person I've met in years who genuinely doesn't want anything from me, and that makes me want to understand what you do want." Sophie felt something shift in her chest, a fluttering sensation that had nothing to do with the intimidating restaurant or the business conversation. There was something in Daniel's eyes when he looked at her that made her feel seen in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. "I want to be useful," she said quietly. "I want to know that my work matters, that it makes things better for people, but I don't need to be visible to do that." "What if visibility was just a side effect of impact, not the goal itself?" Daniel asked. "What if taking the position wasn't about changing who you are, but about amplifying what you're already good at?" Their conversation continued through the main course and into dessert, ranging from business philosophy to personal values to Sophie's observations about market trends. Sophie found herself talking more than she had in months, surprised by how easy it was to share her thoughts with someone who seemed genuinely interested in understanding her perspective. As they walked back to the office, Daniel stopped on the sidewalk outside the building. "Sophie, I want to make you a different offer." Sophie felt her heart skip. "Mr. Whitmore, I appreciate everything you've said, but I really don't think—" "Not the director position," he interrupted gently. "Something else. I want you to shadow me for a week. Attend meetings, observe decision-making processes, see what executive-level work actually looks like. No commitment, no pressure to take any position. Just an opportunity to get information that might help you make a more informed choice about your career." End quote. Sophie stared at him. "You want me to follow you around for a week? I want you to see that leadership isn't about being the smartest person in the room or having all the answers," Daniel said. "It's about asking the right questions and listening to people who know more than you do about specific areas. I think you might be surprised by how much of executive work is actually analytical." Sophie knew she should say no. Spending a week in Daniel's orbit would only complicate her carefully ordered life, would expose her to exactly the kind of high-stakes environment she had been trying to avoid. But there was something about his offer that appealed to the part of her that had always been curious about how things worked at the highest levels. "1 week," she said finally. "And if I decide it's not for me, you'll accept that decision and leave me alone?" Daniel smiled, and Sophie noticed that it reached his eyes in a way that transformed his entire face. "1 week, and if you decide it's not for you, I'll personally write you a recommendation letter for any position you want in the company." The next Monday, Sophie found herself in Daniel's outer office at 7:30 in the morning, nursing her third cup of coffee and trying to calm her nerves. His assistant, Maria, was a woman in her 40s with the kind of efficient competence that Sophie admired and envied. "He's finishing up a call with Tokyo," Maria explained, handing Sophie a tablet loaded with the day's schedule. "You'll want to review the agenda for the board meeting at 10, and there's background material for the 3 o'clock with the European partners." Sophie scrolled through the schedule, her eyes widening. Daniel had back-to-back meetings from 8 in the morning until 6 in the evening, with topics ranging from quarterly projections to merger discussions, to strategic planning sessions. Each meeting had detailed background documents, financial analyses, and decision matrices that looked more complex than anything she had worked on in her current role. When Daniel emerged from his office, he looked as polished and composed as ever, but Sophie caught a glimpse of exhaustion around his eyes that suggested his day had started long before 7:30. "Ready for the grand tour?" he asked, his tone light despite the obvious weight of his schedule. The first meeting was with the senior finance team, discussing quarterly projections that Sophie recognized from her own departmental work. She was surprised to discover how much of the conversation centered around questions, rather than declarations, how Daniel pushed his team to defend their assumptions and consider alternative scenarios. "Sophie," he said during a discussion about market volatility, "you've been tracking consumer behavior patterns in your sector analysis. What's your read on the correlation between housing costs and discretionary spending in our target demographics?" Sophie felt every eye in the room turn to her, but instead of the usual panic, she found herself thinking about the data she had been analyzing. "The correlation is stronger than the models suggest," she said slowly. "Housing costs are rising faster than income in most of our markets, which creates a lag effect on discretionary spending that doesn't show up in quarterly data, but becomes visible over 6 to 9 month periods." Daniel nodded, making notes on his tablet. "That suggests we should be more conservative in our expansion timeline for the retail division. Can you run some models on delayed market entry scenarios?" Sophie found herself volunteering to prepare additional analysis, drawn into the problem-solving aspect of strategic planning in ways she hadn't expected. By the end of the meeting, she had commitments to provide 3 different analytical frameworks that would inform major business decisions. The pattern continued throughout the day. In each meeting, Daniel would bring Sophie into the conversation, asking for her perspective on data trends or analytical approaches. She began to see that executive decision-making wasn't about having all the answers, but about asking the right questions and synthesizing information from multiple sources. During the board meeting, Sophie sat in the back of the room, observing as Daniel presented quarterly results to a group of investors and advisors who looked like they could buy and sell companies on a whim. She was struck by his composure, the way he acknowledged uncertainties while maintaining confidence in the company's strategic direction. "The Southeast expansion is tracking ahead of projections," he reported, clicking through slides that Sophie recognized from her own analytical work. "But we're seeing some market volatility that suggests we should consider a more graduated approach to the retail rollout." One of the board members, a silver-haired woman with sharp eyes, leaned forward. "What kind of volatility?" Daniel glanced toward Sophie, and she felt her heart skip as she realized he was inviting her to respond. She stood up slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she addressed the most powerful people she had ever been in a room with. "Consumer discretionary spending is showing delayed response patterns to housing cost increases," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "The models most retailers use assume quarterly adjustments, but we're seeing evidence that consumer behavior changes take 6 to 9 months to fully manifest in spending patterns." The room was silent for a moment, and Sophie wondered if she had said something wrong. Then the silver-haired woman smiled. "That's a sophisticated analysis," she said. "Do you have recommendations for timeline adjustments?" Sophie found herself walking through her preliminary findings, suggesting a phased approach that would allow the company to test market response before committing to full expansion. The board members asked follow-up questions, and Sophie answered them with increasing confidence, drawing on months of detailed analysis she had never imagined would be relevant at this level. After the meeting, Daniel walked her back to his office. "How did that feel?" he asked. Sophie considered the question. "Terrifying," she said honestly, "but also exhilarating. I didn't realize my work connected to such big-picture decisions." "Your work has always connected to big-picture decisions," Daniel replied. "The difference is that now you get to see the impact." As the week progressed, Sophie found herself looking forward to each day with an anticipation she hadn't felt about work in years. She was still uncomfortable with the visibility, still nervous about speaking up in meetings, but she was beginning to understand what Daniel had meant about amplifying what she was already good at. On Wednesday, they attended a strategy session about international expansion where Sophie's analysis of currency fluctuation patterns helped the team identify markets with more stable long-term potential. On Thursday, her insights about supply chain vulnerabilities informed decisions about vendor diversification that could save the company millions in potential disruptions. By Friday, Sophie was starting to see patterns in how Daniel approached leadership that challenged her assumptions about executive work. He asked more questions than he answered, listened more than he spoke, and seemed genuinely interested in understanding problems from multiple angles before making decisions. "You're a very different kind of CEO than I expected," she told him as they walked to their final meeting of the week. Daniel smiled. "What kind did you expect?" "Someone who already had all the answers," Sophie admitted. "Someone who made decisions based on instinct or experience rather than analysis. I learned early that the most expensive mistakes come from assuming you know more than you do," Daniel said. "The best decisions come from combining good analysis with input from people who understand the details better than I ever could." Their last meeting was with the senior leadership team, reviewing strategic priorities for the coming quarter. Sophie had prepared a comprehensive analysis of market trends and competitive positioning that would inform resource allocation decisions across multiple divisions. As she presented her findings, Sophie realized that something fundamental had shifted in how she saw herself. She was still the same person who preferred spreadsheets to cocktail parties, who found comfort in data and struggled with small talk. But she was beginning to understand that those qualities didn't disqualify her from leadership. They simply meant she would lead differently than someone else might. "Your analysis suggests we should prioritize the healthcare technology division over retail expansion," said the CFO, a man in his 50s who had been skeptical of Sophie's inclusion in executive meetings. "In the short term, yes," Sophie replied, clicking to a slide that showed comparative growth projections. "Healthcare technology has more stable demand patterns and higher barriers to competition. Retail expansion has higher potential returns, but also higher volatility and risk factors that could impact quarterly performance. But retail expansion has been a strategic priority for 2 years," pointed out the head of marketing. Sophie felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with disagreement, but she pushed through it. "Strategic priorities should evolve based on market conditions," she said. "The data suggests that our competitive advantage in healthcare technology is increasing, while our advantage in retail is being eroded by market saturation and new competitors." The room fell silent as the leadership team considered her analysis. Sophie could feel her heart racing, wondering if she had overstepped, if her directness had been inappropriate for someone who was essentially a guest in these meetings. Then Daniel spoke up. "Sophie's analysis aligns with market intelligence we've been gathering from other sources," he said. "I think we need to seriously consider reallocating resources based on these findings." The meeting continued for another hour, with Sophie's recommendations forming the foundation for strategic planning discussions that would shape the company's direction for months to come. As the team filed out, Sophie realized that her work had just influenced decisions that would affect thousands of employees and millions of dollars in investment. "How do you feel about that?" Daniel asked as they walked back to his office. Sophie thought about the question. "Responsible," she said finally. "And a little bit terrified, but also like, this might be what I was meant to do." Daniel stopped walking and turned to face her. "Does that mean you're reconsidering the director position?" Sophie met his eyes, seeing something there that made her pulse quicken. Over the past week, she had become aware of Daniel not just as a CEO, but as a person. She had watched him navigate difficult conversations with patience and insight, had seen him treat everyone from executives to janitors with the same respect and attention. She had caught glimpses of humor and vulnerability beneath his polished professional exterior, and she was beginning to suspect that her interest in him went beyond professional admiration. "I'm considering it," she said carefully. "But I have conditions." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." "I want to build my own team," Sophie said. "I want to hire analysts who think like I do, who are more comfortable with data than with politics. And I want to report directly to you, not through layers of management that might filter or change my recommendations." "Done," Daniel said without hesitation. "And I want to start slowly," Sophie continued. Maybe with a pilot program or specific project, rather than jumping into full strategic oversight. Daniel nodded. We could start with the healthcare technology expansion. It's a significant project, but contained enough that you could test your approach without affecting the entire company. Sophie felt a flutter of excitement mixed with terror. And if I fail? Then you'll learn something and try again, Daniel said simply. But I don't think you're going to fail. They had reached his office, and Daniel paused with his hand on the door. Sophie, can I ask you something personal? Sophie's heart skipped. Okay. This week, watching you discover what you're capable of, seeing you gain confidence in your own judgment and expertise, it's been... He paused, seeming to search for words. It's been remarkable, and I find myself hoping that your decision isn't just about the work. Sophie stared at him, trying to process what he seemed to be saying. What do you mean? Daniel stepped closer, and Sophie caught a hint of his cologne, something subtle and expensive that made her acutely aware of his physical presence. I mean that I've enjoyed spending time with you this week. I've enjoyed our conversations, your perspective, the way you challenge assumptions I didn't even realize I was making. And I'm hoping that accepting the position means I'll continue to have reasons to spend time with you. Sophie felt heat rise in her cheeks. Mr. Whitmore, I don't think... Daniel, he said softly, and I'm not asking you to decide anything right now. I'm just telling you that my interest in you goes beyond your analytical skills, impressive as they are. Sophie's mind was racing. Daniel Whitmore, Billionaire CEO, was apparently interested in her as more than an employee. It seemed impossible, like something that happened to other people in movies or romance novels, not to quiet analysts who preferred spreadsheets to socializing. I need to think about this, she said finally. Daniel nodded, stepping back to give her space. Of course, take all the time you need. The position will be available whenever you're ready to accept it. Over the weekend, Sophie found herself unable to concentrate on anything. She walked through her small apartment, trying to imagine what her life would look like if she accepted Daniel's offer. The professional opportunity was significant, a chance to influence decisions that could affect thousands of people and shape the direction of a major corporation. But the personal implications were even more overwhelming. She called her best friend from college, Lisa, who lived in Seattle and worked as a software engineer. Let me get this straight, Lisa said after Sophie had explained the situation. A billionaire CEO offered you a dream job and basically asked you out, and you're considering turning it down because you're scared? It's not that simple, Sophie protested. We work together. He's my boss, and I'm not the kind of person who dates billionaires. What kind of person dates billionaires? Lisa asked. Sophie, you're brilliant. You're kind. You're genuine. Why wouldn't someone be attracted to those qualities? Because I'm not glamorous or sophisticated or any of the things that successful men usually want, Sophie said. I'm scared that if I take this job and things don't work out personally, I'll lose everything professionally too. Or, Lisa said gently, you could trust that someone who has shown you respect and genuine interest might actually be worth taking a risk for. Sophie spent Sunday walking through the park near her apartment, thinking about Daniel's offer and her own fears. She had always been cautious, always chosen the safe path, and it had given her stability, but also kept her from discovering what she might be capable of. On Monday morning, she arrived at work early as usual, but instead of going to her cubicle, she took the elevator to the 52nd floor. Maria looked surprised to see her. Is Mr. Whitmore available? Sophie asked. He's on a call, but he said to let him know immediately if you came by, Maria replied with a knowing smile. Daniel's office door opened a moment later, and he gestured for her to come in. He was wearing a navy suit that made his dark eyes look even more intense, and Sophie felt that familiar flutter of attraction mixed with nervousness. I've made my decision, she said without preamble. Daniel closed the door behind her and turned to face her fully. And? I'll take the position, Sophie said. With the conditions we discussed. Daniel's face broke into a smile that transformed his entire expression. I'm glad. But, Sophie continued, holding up a hand. I need to know that this is about my qualifications, not about your personal interest in me. I can't succeed in this role if people think I got it for the wrong reasons." Daniel's expression became serious. "Sophie, I offered you this position before I knew I was personally interested in you. Your qualifications speak for themselves. But I won't pretend that getting to know you better this week hasn't made me hope for more than just a professional relationship." Sophie felt her heart racing. "What exactly are you hoping for?" Daniel stepped closer, but carefully, giving her space to retreat if she wanted to. "I'm hoping that you might be interested in having dinner with me sometime. Away from the office, away from work, just two people getting to know each other." Sophie looked into his eyes, seeing sincerity there along with something that looked like vulnerability. Daniel Whitmore, who commanded boardrooms and negotiated billion-dollar deals, was nervous about asking her on a date. "One dinner," she said finally. "But we keep work and personal separate. I need to prove myself in this position on my own merits." Daniel nodded. "Absolutely. Though I should warn you, keeping personal feelings separate from professional respect might be more challenging than you think." Sophie felt a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Are you suggesting that your interest in me might interfere with your professional judgment?" "I'm suggesting that discovering someone who challenges you intellectually and intrigues you personally is a rare thing," Daniel replied. "And I'm hoping you might find me at least half as interesting as I find you." Sophie considered this, thinking about the week she had just spent watching Daniel navigate complex decisions with wisdom and integrity, seeing glimpses of humor and kindness beneath his professional exterior. "I suppose I could find out," she said softly. Daniel's smile was radiant. "Saturday night? I know a place that serves excellent food and has very quiet corners where we can actually hear each other talk." "It's a date," Sophie said, then immediately blushed at her own boldness. Over the following months, Sophie threw herself into her new role with the same analytical precision she had brought to her previous work. She built a team of young analysts who shared her preference for data over politics, and together they developed analytical frameworks that informed major strategic decisions across the company. The healthcare technology expansion that she had recommended became a significant success, opening markets that generated millions in revenue and established Whitmore Industries as a leader in an emerging field. Sophie's approach to strategic analysis, combining rigorous data modeling with careful attention to market dynamics, became a template for decision-making across the company. Her relationship with Daniel evolved more slowly, built on quiet dinners where they talked about everything from business philosophy to childhood memories. Walks through the city, where Sophie discovered that Daniel's confidence in professional settings masked the same kinds of insecurities and uncertainties that everyone carried. "I never expected to find someone who understood the weight of responsibility the way you do," he told her one evening as they walked along the river. "Most people see the success and the money, but they don't see the constant pressure of knowing that your decisions affect so many lives." Sophie understood what he meant. Her new position had given her influence over resource allocation and strategic direction that could impact thousands of employees and their families. It was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. "I never expected to find someone who made me want to be braver," she replied. "You saw something in me that I didn't see in myself." Daniel stopped walking and turned to face her. "I saw what was already there. You just needed the right opportunity to let it show." 6 months after accepting the director position, Sophie was presenting quarterly analysis to the board of directors. The same silver-haired woman who had challenged her during her first board meeting, nodding approvingly as Sophie walked through market projections and strategic recommendations. "Exceptional work, as always," the woman said as the meeting concluded. "Your analytical framework has become indispensable to our decision-making process." After the board members had filed out, Daniel lingered in the conference room with Sophie, watching as she packed up her presentation materials with the same methodical care she brought to everything. "You realize what you just did, don't you?" he said, leaning against the polished table. Sophie looked up from her laptop. "Presented quarterly projections?" Daniel shook his head, smiling. "You just convinced a room full of investors to pivot our entire European strategy based on your analysis of regulatory trends. Margaret Harrison, who's been on this board for 15 years, told me after the meeting that your insights reminded her why she got into venture capital in the first place." End quote. Sophie felt the familiar warmth that came with recognition of her work, but it was tempered now by a deeper understanding of the responsibility that came with influence. The data was clear. European privacy regulations are going to reshape the entire digital marketplace over the next 2 years. Companies that prepare now will have significant advantages, and companies that don't will find themselves scrambling to catch up, Daniel agreed. Your recommendation to accelerate our compliance technology development could put us years ahead of our competitors. As they walked back toward the elevators, Sophie reflected on how much her life had changed since that Tuesday morning when she had first sat in a conference room and said no to Daniel's initial offer. She had grown into her role as director of strategic analysis in ways she never could have imagined, building a reputation for insightful analysis that had earned respect throughout the industry. Her team had expanded to 12 analysts, each carefully chosen for their analytical rigor and their ability to see patterns that others missed. Together, they had developed predictive models that had helped Whitmore Industries navigate market volatility, identify emerging opportunities, and avoid costly mistakes that had trapped their competitors. But perhaps more importantly, Sophie had discovered that leadership didn't require her to become someone else. Her quiet, thoughtful approach had proven to be exactly what the company needed in an era of rapid change and increasing complexity. She led through careful analysis and collaborative problem-solving rather than charismatic speeches or aggressive decision-making. "I have something I want to show you," Daniel said as they reached the executive floor. Instead of heading toward his office, he led her down a hallway she had never explored. "Where are we going?" Sophie asked. "You'll see," Daniel replied, stopping in front of a door marked with a nameplate that read, "Strategic Analysis Suite." He handed her a key card. "Your new offices. I thought it was time your team had space that reflected their importance to the company." Sophie swept the card and stepped into a suite of offices that took her breath away. The main workspace was designed for collaboration, with whiteboards covering entire walls and flexible furniture that could be reconfigured for different types of analysis. Individual offices lined the perimeter, each with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered spectacular views of the city. "Daniel, this is incredible," she said, walking through the space and imagining how her team would use it. "But this must have cost a fortune." "Good analysis saves us millions," Daniel replied. "This is an investment in the people who make that possible." Sophie turned to face him, struck by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. Over the months they had been working together and dating, she had come to understand that Daniel's success came not from ruthless ambition or inherited privilege, but from a genuine commitment to building something meaningful and sustainable. "There's something else," Daniel said, his tone becoming more serious. "I've been invited to speak at the Global Business Summit in Geneva next month. I'd like you to come with me, not just as my director of strategic analysis, but as my partner." Sophie felt her heart skip. They had been careful to keep their professional and personal relationships separate, but she knew that attending such a high-profile event together would signal to the business world that their relationship had evolved beyond casual dating. "Are you sure that's wise?" she asked. "There will be media attention, speculation about our relationship. It could complicate things for both of us." Daniel stepped closer, taking her hands in his. "Sophie, I spent the last 6 months watching you transform from someone who was afraid of her own capabilities into one of the most respected strategic analysts in the industry. You've earned the right to be recognized for your achievements, and I'm proud to be associated with you both professionally and personally." Sophie searched his face, seeing the sincerity there that had first drawn her to him. "What exactly are you asking me?" "I'm asking if you're ready to stop hiding," Daniel said gently. "You've proven that you belong at the highest levels of business. You've built something remarkable here, earned respect from people who don't give it easily. And I'm asking if you're ready to let the world see what I've known all along, that you're extraordinary." Sophie thought about the shy analyst who had sat in a conference room 6 months ago, terrified of visibility and convinced that she wasn't qualified for leadership. That person felt like a stranger now, though Sophie recognized that the core of who she was hadn't changed. She was still more comfortable with data than with crowds, still preferred thoughtful analysis to quick decisions. but she had learned that those qualities were strengths, not limitations. "I'll go with you," she said finally. "But not because I'm ready to stop hiding. Because I'm ready to start being fully myself, in public as well as private." Daniel's smile was brilliant. "I can't think of anything I'd rather have by my side." The Geneva summit was unlike anything Sophie had ever experienced. The hotel was filled with business leaders, politicians, and journalists from around the world, all networking and deal-making in the elegant lobbies and conference rooms. Sophie felt somewhat overwhelmed by the scale and sophistication of it all, but she was no longer paralyzed by social situations the way she once had been. Daniel's keynote speech focused on the importance of analytical thinking and strategic decision-making, and he made several references to the work Sophie's team had done at Whitmore Industries. Sitting in the audience, Sophie felt a surge of pride, not just in her own achievements, but in Daniel's willingness to share credit and highlight the contributions of others. After the speech, they were surrounded by other attendees who wanted to discuss Daniel's presentation and learn more about Whitmore Industries' analytical approaches. Sophie found herself drawn into conversations about predictive modeling and market analysis, discussing technical details with executives from companies around the world. "Your insights about regulatory impact on market dynamics were fascinating," said a woman who introduced herself as the chief strategy officer of a major European corporation. "We've been struggling with similar challenges in our expansion planning." Sophie spent 20 minutes walking the woman through the analytical framework her team had developed, explaining how they had identified leading indicators that predicted regulatory changes months before they were officially announced. By the end of the conversation, the woman was asking for Sophie's business card and suggesting a formal consulting arrangement. "You realize what just happened?" Daniel asked as they walked back to their hotel room that evening. Sophie was still processing the day's conversations. "I think I just accidentally started a consulting business?" Daniel laughed. "You just established yourself as one of the leading voices in strategic analysis. 3 different people asked me how they could hire you away from Whitmore Industries." Sophie felt a flutter of panic. "They want to hire me?" "They want your expertise," Daniel corrected. "Which brings me to something I've been thinking about. What if we created a new division within Whitmore Industries? Strategic consulting, led by you, providing analytical services to other companies." Sophie stared at him. "You want me to run my own division?" "I want you to build something that leverages your unique abilities," Daniel said. "You've proven that your analytical approach can transform decision-making. Why limit that impact to one company?" Over the next hour, they sketched out possibilities for a consulting division that would allow Sophie to work with companies across multiple industries, applying her analytical frameworks to diverse strategic challenges. It was an opportunity that would have terrified the Sophie of 6 months ago, but the woman she had become was intrigued by the complexity and potential impact. "There's one condition," Sophie said as they finalized their ideas. "I want to maintain the culture we've built in my current team. Collaborative, thoughtful, focused on getting the right answer rather than the popular one. Would you expect anything else?" Daniel replied, "That culture is exactly what makes your work so valuable." They were sitting on the balcony of their hotel room, looking out over Lake Geneva as the sun set behind the mountains. The setting was impossibly romantic, and Sophie was acutely aware of how much her life had changed since that first lunch meeting, when Daniel had challenged her assumptions about her own capabilities. "Can I ask you something?" she said, turning to face him. "Anything. That first day, when I turned down the director position, what made you decide to pursue it instead of just accepting my refusal?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "Honestly, it was partly professional and partly personal, though I didn't realize the personal part at the time." "What do you mean?" "Professionally, I recognized that someone who had turned down a significant promotion because they genuinely believed it wasn't right for them probably had better judgment than most people who actively seek positions," Daniel explained. "But, personally, I was intrigued by someone who wasn't trying to impress me or get something from me. You were the first person I'd met in years who seemed completely uninterested in my wealth or status." Sophie smiled. "I was terrified of your wealth and status," which made you refreshingly honest about your concerns and limitations, Daniel replied. Most people pretend they're qualified for anything I offer them. You were brave enough to admit uncertainty, and that made me trust your judgment. And now? Daniel reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. Now, I've watched you grow into someone who combines analytical brilliance with genuine leadership ability. You've earned the respect of our board, our employees, and our competitors. But more than that, you've become someone I can't imagine my life without. Sophie felt her heart racing. There was something in Daniel's tone that suggested this conversation was heading somewhere significant. Sophie, he continued, I know we agreed to take things slowly, to keep our professional and personal relationships carefully balanced. But I've reached a point where I can't pretend that my feelings for you are casual or temporary. He stood up and walked to the railing, looking out over the lake. I've been successful in business because I know how to recognize value, how to identify opportunities that others miss, and I know that what we have together is the most valuable thing in my life. Sophie joined him at the railing, her pulse pounding. Daniel, what are you saying? He turned to face her, and Sophie saw vulnerability in his expression that she had never seen before. I'm saying that I love you. I love your brilliant mind, and your careful heart, and your willingness to challenge assumptions that everyone else accepts without question. I love watching you discover what you're capable of, and I love being the person you trust enough to share your uncertainties with. End quote. Sophie felt tears prick at her eyes. I love you too, she said softly. I love how you see potential in people they don't see in themselves. I love how you lead with questions instead of assumptions. And I love how you make me feel brave enough to become who I was meant to be. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. I know this might seem fast, he said, opening the box to reveal a ring that was elegant and understated, perfect in its simplicity. But I also know that when you find something extraordinary, you don't let it go. Sophie Lin, will you marry me? Sophie stared at the ring, then at Daniel's face, seeing hope and nervousness and love all mixed together in his expression. 6 months ago, she would have been overwhelmed by the impossibility of it all, convinced that she wasn't the kind of person who married billionaire CEOs. But the woman she had become understood that love wasn't about fitting into predetermined categories or meeting other people's expectations. Yes, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. Yes, I'll marry you. Daniel's face transformed with relief and joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as though he had somehow known exactly what would suit her. Sophie looked down at it, marveling at how something so small could represent such a monumental change in her life. I have one request, she said, as Daniel pulled her into his arms. Anything. When we announce our engagement, I want it to be clear that this doesn't change my professional role or my commitment to building the consulting division, Sophie said. I need people to know that I'm not stepping back from my career. Daniel smiled. I wouldn't expect anything else. You've worked too hard to build your reputation to compromise it now. They spent the rest of the evening on the balcony, talking about their future together and the life they wanted to build. Sophie felt a sense of completeness she had never experienced before, as though all the careful choices and safe decisions of her past had led her to this moment where everything finally made sense. The announcement of their engagement 6 weeks later generated significant media attention, with business publications running articles about the power couple and their influence on strategic business analysis. Sophie was uncomfortable with the publicity at first, but she gradually came to understand that her visibility could be used to advocate for analytical rigor in business decision-making. Her consulting division launched 3 months after their engagement, with a client list that included Fortune 500 companies seeking the kind of predictive analysis that had made Whitmore Industries so successful. Sophie built a team of brilliant analysts from diverse backgrounds, creating a culture that valued thoughtful analysis over quick conclusions. The wedding itself was smaller and more intimate than the media had expected, held in a garden overlooking the ocean with only close family and friends in attendance. Sophie wore a dress that was elegant but not ostentatious, and Daniel's vows focused on partnership and mutual support rather than grand romantic gestures. I promise to continue challenging you to see your own worth, he said, looking into her eyes as they exchanged rings. And I promise to build a life with you that honors both your brilliant mind and your generous heart. Sophie's vows were equally practical and heartfelt. I promise to continue growing into the person you saw in me before I saw it myself, she said. And I promise to be the partner you deserve, in business and in life. As they danced at their reception, Sophie reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She was still the same person who preferred data to small talk, who found comfort in analysis and struggled with crowds. But she had learned that those qualities didn't limit her potential. They simply meant she would achieve success in her own unique way. No regrets? Daniel whispered as they swayed to the music. Sophie looked around at the gathering of family, friends, and colleagues who had supported them both through their individual journeys and their relationship. Her parents, who had traveled from California and were beaming with pride at their daughter's success. Her analytical team, who had become like family to her. The board members and business partners who had come to respect her insights and leadership. Only one, she said, smiling up at her new husband. What's that? I regret that it took me so long to say yes to taking risks, Sophie replied. But I suppose everything happened exactly when it was supposed to. Daniel spun her gently, and Sophie laughed as her dress flared around her. For the first time in her life, she felt completely comfortable being the center of attention, secure in the knowledge that she had earned her place through hard work and genuine ability rather than circumstances or luck. 2 years later, Sophie's consulting division had become one of the most sought-after strategic analysis firms in the country. Her approach to predictive modeling had influenced decision-making at companies across multiple industries, and she had been invited to speak at business schools about the importance of analytical thinking in leadership. She was preparing for a presentation at Harvard Business School when Daniel appeared in her office with 2 cups of coffee and a familiar expression that suggested he had something important to discuss. I have a proposition for you, he said, settling into the chair across from her desk. Sophie looked up from her presentation notes. I'm listening. The board has approved funding for a new venture, Daniel said. An independent strategic consulting firm that would operate separately from Whitmore Industries but maintain our partnership agreements. You would be the founder and CEO. Sophie stared at him. You want me to leave Whitmore Industries? I want you to build something that's entirely yours, Daniel corrected. You've proven that your analytical approach can transform businesses. Why not create a company dedicated to that mission? Sophie leaned back in her chair, considering the implications. Running her own company would mean complete autonomy over her approach and culture, the ability to choose clients and projects based on impact rather than politics. It would also mean leaving the security of her position at Whitmore Industries for the uncertainty of entrepreneurship. What does this mean for us? She asked. Professionally, I mean. Daniel smiled. It means we become business partners as well as life partners. Whitmore Industries would be your first major client, and we'd maintain our collaboration on strategic analysis. But you'd have the freedom to work with other companies without any conflicts of interest. Sophie felt the familiar flutter of excitement mixed with terror that had become her signal that an opportunity was worth considering. I'd want to bring my entire team. I'd be disappointed if you didn't, Daniel replied. And I'd want to maintain our analytical standards, even if it means slower growth or smaller profits. Quality over quantity, Daniel agreed. That's always been your approach. Sophie stood up and walked to her window, looking out over the city where she had built her career and found her confidence. The shy analyst who had once been terrified of visibility felt like a character from someone else's story, though Sophie could trace the direct line from that person to who she had become. When would this happen? She asked. Whenever you're ready, Daniel said. There's no timeline, except your own comfort level. Sophie turned back to face him, seeing pride and love in his expression, along with genuine excitement about her potential. Over the past 2 years, he had consistently supported her growth and encouraged her to take on greater challenges. This offer felt like the natural culmination of that support. I'll do it, she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. I'll start my own firm. Daniel's smile was radiant. I was hoping you'd say that. 6 months later, Sophie stood in the lobby of her own company, Lin Strategic Analysis, watching as her team moved into offices they had designed specifically for collaborative analytical work. The space reflected her values and approach, with flexible workspaces that could accommodate different types of thinking and analysis. Her client roster included companies from technology to healthcare to manufacturing, all seeking the kind of predictive analysis that had become her signature. She had hired analysts from diverse backgrounds and disciplines, creating a team that could approach problems from multiple angles while maintaining her commitment to rigorous data-driven decision-making. Daniel stopped by on her first official day as CEO, carrying flowers and wearing the proud expression she had come to love. "How does it feel to be running your own company?" he asked. Sophie looked around at the bustling office, at her team diving into complex analytical challenges with the enthusiasm she remembered from her early days at Whitmore Industries. "It feels like coming home," she said. "Like this is what I was always meant to do. And to think it all started because you were brave enough to say no to a job you didn't want," Daniel observed. Sophie laughed, remembering that terrifying morning in the conference room when she had turned down his first offer. "I wasn't being brave. I was being terrified." "Sometimes they're the same thing," Daniel replied, pulling her into his arms. "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is trust your own judgment, even when everyone else thinks you're making a mistake." Sophie looked into the eyes of the man who had seen her potential before she had recognized it herself, who had challenged her to grow while accepting exactly who she was. "I love you for seeing who I could become," she said. "I love you for becoming everything you were always meant to be," Daniel replied. As Sophie settled into her role as CEO of her own company, she often thought about the journey that had brought her there. She had learned that leadership didn't require her to become someone else, that her analytical mind and careful approach were exactly what the business world needed. She had discovered that taking risks didn't mean abandoning her values, but rather finding ways to express those values more fully. Most importantly, she had learned that sometimes the best opportunities come from saying no to what doesn't fit and waiting for what does. Her refusal to accept Daniel's first offer had led to everything she valued most in her life: her successful career, her meaningful work, and her partnership with someone who truly understood and appreciated who she was. The shy girl who had once been afraid of her own shadow had become a confident leader who influenced strategic decisions across multiple industries. But at her core, she was still the same person who preferred data to drama, who found beauty in well-constructed analysis, and who believed that the best decisions came from careful thought rather than quick judgments. And as she looked toward the future, Sophie knew that her greatest adventures were still ahead of her, built on the foundation of analytical rigor, authentic leadership, and the love of a man who had seen her worth from the very top. Beginning.